All right, diabetes. All right. So we talked about things where we had structural defects, obstructive disorders. We had celiac, which was a malabsorption. Now this is an endocrine dysfunction. So all different sorts of things cause nutritional deficits. So diabetes mellitus. It is a deficiency of the hormone insulin. Type 1. Sorry, hold on. Type 1 is what we call an absolute deficiency. So there is destruction of the pancreatic beta cells. And those pancreatic beta cells is what develops insulin. So with type 1, they have absolute deficiency. They don't have any insulin because the beta cells are destroyed and they can't produce it. This is what typically happens in childhood and adolescence is type 1. Now there's type 2, which did, I don't know, because you guys LPN, right? You did 1 and 2 combined? Mm-hmm. So did you talk about type 2 previously? Yeah, okay. So I'm not going to spend any time on that. And then there's something called MODY, which is maturity onset diabetes of the young. We're not going to discuss those two types of diabetes here, okay? We're just going to focus on type 1.
Do we need to know those for exam purposes?
I can't discuss that.
Oh. Okay.
All right. So what causes it? It's hereditary, but they don't inherit it. Like it's not a gene that somebody gets, but you tend to see it in families. And then there's also environmental factors.
It's hereditary, but you know.
Inherited. Meaning hereditary means you tend to see it in families, but it's not like, you know, when you guys learned about in the... Yes, exactly, like autosomal recessive, autosomal dominant, like when we were talking about hemophilia or sickle cell disease, and you get like a gene that causes it. You don't have a gene that causes diabetes mellitus. It just, you tend to see it. They diagnose it, you either have a fasting glucose of greater than 126 or a random glucose, and these are serum glucose levels, so not a finger prick, but serum glucose levels of fasting of greater than 126 and random greater than 200.
Greater than 126?
Yep. So what is the purpose of insulin? Right? So insulin is kind of the key, right? And it helps support the metabolism of like fats and protein, carbohydrates, basically sugars, okay? Oh, plus it needs signs and symptoms of diabetes. So normally, the stomach changes food into glucose. The glucose enters the bloodstream. And then insulin pushes that glucose into the cells so that the cells can be used, right? So insulin is that key that pushes it in. So if there's no insulin, glucose can't go into the cell. So where does that glucose stay? In the bloodstream, right? In circulation. So the glucose that's in the bloodstream is high. So insulin is supposed to move glucose into the cell, but we don't have enough. So glucose can't go into the cell, so it just kind of stays out. So glucose in the bloodstream is high. That's why they get hyperglycemia, right? All these signs and symptoms make total sense if you think about what it does. Hyperglycemia is just high blood sugar, which is happening because insulin's not putting it into the cells. That's why we diagnose it with a fasting of 126 and a random of 200. So, fluid moves from intracellular to extracellular. Because remember, Dr. Chastain talked about hypotonic, hypertonic, isotonic fluids. What does glucose do? It causes that osmotic pull, right? So if I have a bunch of sugar on the outside, oh, this works fabulous. Yeah. So here is my, intravascular space, right? And here are my cells. And I've got sugar. I don't know what to represent for sugar. I'm just going to put S's, okay? I've got a bunch of S's out here. My H2O's in here. It's going to get pulled out. All my H2O gets pulled out because it wants to follow sugar, right? So my sugar is high in my blood, causing hyperglycemia. And then fluid is moving from inside the cell out here.
So your cells are shrinking?
Yeah. And all that fluid's got to go somewhere, right? So I now have all this fluid that's going outside my cells and into the bloodstream. So it goes to the kidneys. So it moves into the glomerular filtrate. But the kidneys can only take so much. So the kidneys are like, okay, you've got this extra sugar, you've got this extra fluid. Kidneys are like, okay, I got this up to a point. Then it says, okay, I've got too much. You've exceeded my threshold. I can only reabsorb or take care of so much. So then glucose spills into the urine. So that's why we get the glycosuria. I can't talk tonight. The glucose exceeds the threshold of the glomerular filtrate of the kidneys, right? It's that renal threshold. The kidneys can basically filter so much glucose. Once it's filtered all the glucose it can filter, then it just spills over into the urine. That's why when we get a urine sample, there's a bunch of glucose in there, which is one of the clinical manifestations. Because all this sugar is outside and water is following sugar because of that osmotic effect. And then that's got to be filtered by the kidneys, right? All this fluid's got to go somewhere and it gets filtered by the kidneys. So it's trying to filter as much sugar as it can, but it can only do so much. So whatever sugar it can't filter gets spilled out into the urine. In addition, it's got all this fluid it's dealing with. So that's why these people pee their brains out, right? Because they've got all this fluid to deal with. All this fluid is following this glucose. And the kidneys are just dumping out they're like, we're doing the best we can. We're going to pee out all this fluid, and then we're going to filter as much sugar as we can, and whatever we can't filter, we're just going to dump in the urine. So that's why you have polyuria. So, if I'm peeing all the time, what does that make me? Thirsty. So, I get polydipsia. And what do we pee out? What electrolyte? Potassium. So, what's going to happen to my potassium if I'm peeing it out? It's going to drop. Okay, so all my clinical manifestations make perfect sense to me, right? Well, in addition to that, when glucose doesn't enter the cell, it can't metabolize carbohydrates and all of that, right? And that metabolizing the carbohydrate is what gives us energy. It what lets us go ahead and our bodies work and move. So when it doesn't go into the cell, we start breaking down proteins. We want to use protein as our energy source. So protein is converted to glucose in the liver, and that's that glycogenesis. So instead of using our carbohydrates like we want, using our sugars for energy, we start breaking down protein. Well, that's what makes us so hungry, because our bodies is saying we need sugars to work and we're not getting it. So when our liver is breaking down all the protein, the body's saying, oh crap, we're breaking down protein. That must mean we need sugar. So I want to eat some more. I want to eat some more. Because I think I need it. Even though I don't need more sugar. I just need the insulin to enter it in.
Does that say
Polyphagia.
Polyphagia.
Polyphagia. They're hungry. So they tend to be super skinny despite having a really hearty appetite. Because they're hungry all the time. Because in their mind, their body thinks that they need more food as an energy source. They don't need more food, they just need the insulin to use their energy source. So fat becomes a source of energy because they can't use those carbohydrates. And that fat is broken down and converted into ketones. Which one? Which one? You got it? History of hearty appetite. Same thing. You can have a heavy appetite if you like. Hearty appetite. So then fat becomes the source of energy. And when fat is broken down, what does fat produce? It says it up there. Ketones. So, we have a lot of ketones in our body, and our body tries to get rid of it. So we get rid of it in the urine, and that's why people with diabetes have ketonuria. They try to get rid of it in the lungs. So that's why they have that fruity breath, that acetone breath, because it's the ketones that they're breathing out. And they try to get rid of it in the blood. And if I'm going too fast, let me know. I'm sorry.
This is urine, lungs, blood.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Is everyone caught up, or do I need to slow down for a second? Okay. So, when ketones are in the blood, they're acidic. That's why you have the ketoacidosis. And the longer that your body uses fat as a storage or as a form of energy, the more ketones you have, the worse these are. Okay? So if you are using fat as a source of energy for a long time and you're in ketoacidosis, you start developing these Kussmaul respirations. Does everyone remember what Kussmaul is? The deep, rapid. I'm trying to blow off. And they go into DKA, diabetic ketoacidosis. This is life-threatening. And oftentimes with children, this is how they present. This is how they get diagnosed. They present to the hospital super sick. They are vomiting and hyperventilating. They get a sugar drawn. Their sugar is like 600. It is insanely high because they have been in this form of ketoacidosis for a long time. So insulin is the key, right? The whole problem with type 1 diabetes is there's an absolute deficiency. The pancreatic beta cells are supposed to make insulin, but for whatever reason, they don't. So they don't make that insulin, so this process is happening. And the longer the patient sits in this process, the worse off they get. And maybe in the beginning, your pancreatic cells produced a little bit of insulin. But over time, they stop producing, and they just stop working altogether, or they just stop, your body can't keep up with it. Does that make sense? It's all about the supply and demand. So oftentimes, how we diagnose these kids is because they come to the hospital super sick, vomiting. Parents don't know what's wrong with them. They're lethargic, they're out of it, they're vomiting, they're hyperventilating. They get a sugar, like I said, it's 600, 800. I've seen crazy sugar numbers. Blood glucose numbers, I should say. And then we're like, crap, they're in diabetic ketoacidosis. So we will get a pH on them. The lower, because pH is related to hydrogen ions, right? We said bicarb is alkalotic. With these kids, they're acidotic. So the lower their pH, the worse off they are. I've seen scary pHs of like 6.9, so which is really crazy. So what we have to do is treat it, but we have to treat it very, very slowly. Because remember, fluid follows sugar. So these kids are at really high risk of cerebral edema, and they can actually herniate if you pull fluid off too fast. So we give them insulin because insulin is that key that helps bring the sugar back into the cells to be used. Obviously, they're kept NPO, and we start fluids on them because they're dehydrated, right? All the fluid has left their cells. So I know we think that we need fluid, they're like, oh, well, we've got fluid intravascularly. No, their cells are super dehydrated. So we're going to give fluids for that dehydration. They get potassium supplements, right? Because they've peed out all their potassium. If they're not peeing, do you give potassium? No. Yes, ma'am.
When you give fluids, are you giving IV fluids or oral?
IV fluids. And what type of IV fluids do you think you're going to give? You want it to go back into the cell. So what do you want? Anybody know? All right. So with isotonic fluids, what do they do?
It just stay there.
It just stays there. Hypotonic has less solutes than what's in here, right? So what is that going to do? It's going to pull. Right? And hypertonic has more solutes than in the cell. So that's what's that going to do? Pull it out.
First.
So which one do you want?
Hypo.
Thank you. All right. You're going to want to remember that, okay? So, hypotonic fluids, right? It's going to come back to haunt you from test 1. And then again, monitor for cerebral edema. We don't give them insulin and shoot down their sugar. They are typically sent to either the floor or, depending on how bad their pH is, to an ICU. And they are put on an insulin drip, and their insulin is their sugar is very slowly brought down. Because if you take a serum glucose that's at 600, and all of a sudden you shoot it down to like 100, all that fluid is going to follow, right? And they've got fluid sitting on the brain. You have to slowly take that fluid off. If you just take it out, that brain's going to herniate and they're going to die. So, oh, like they're doing it like super frequently. Every hospital's going to have a policy, and it's going to depend on whether the floor or the ICU. But it's not like I'm going to check in 4 hours. It's every 15 minutes, every 30 minutes, every hour. It's frequently. So treatment. You cannot just treat one thing. You can't just say, well, if the problem is no insulin, then we'll give them insulin. All done. No, we got to do more than that. It's a collaborative management. The first thing, of course, is medications. They get insulin. They can get it sub-Q, which oftentimes, and these kids are like rock stars. I did a stint as a school nurse for like a hot minute. Like literally it was 2 months. And it amazed me because I dealt with a lot of the diabetic kids. They are just total rock stars. They know how much insulin to give themselves. They stick them, they give it to themselves. They check their sugars. They do a great job. Nowadays, they have cool little pumps that they will access themselves, typically right here in this little back fat that we have. They'll access themselves, and that stays for 24 hours, and it's a continuous insulin that they get. They need to learn how to monitor. That's serum blood glucose monitoring. By 9 years of age, kids have got to be able to do this themselves. You cannot baby them because this is something they have for the rest of their life. So, I mean, unfortunately, it just sucks, right? But they've got to learn how to take care of themselves because one day mommy and daddy or their guardian won't be there to do that. So they've got to learn the signs and symptoms of hypoglycemia and hyperglycemia and how to check their sugar and what to do. The hemoglobin A1C, so that's HGB, hemoglobin, A1C. That's the average blood glucose in the last 2 to 3 months. So as red blood cells circulate, glucose attaches to it. And they remain there for the lifespan of the hemoglobin. And the lifespan of a hemoglobin is about 120 days. That's why it's every 3 months. So they can kind of tell, like when we do a finger prick, it just tells us what that sugar is right then and there. But a hemoglobin A1C tells us how that child's been taking care of it over the last 2 or 3 months. So it tells us like basically how compliant they're being. Because they might give themselves some insulin and eat really good right before they see you and be like, look at me, my sugar's perfect. But they have been, not taking care of themselves for 2 months. And you can tell that with the hemoglobin A1C. For a non-diabetic, we want it 4 to 6%. For a diabetic, we need it at least less than 7.5%. And again, they need to know signs and symptoms of hypoglycemia and how to treat it. Now, we don't use urine to monitor glucose because they will often continue to spill because they oftentimes exceed their threshold. So they'll continue to have the glycosuria. So we don't use that to monitor blood or to monitor sugars. We use blood sugar. We can use urine to see how much ketones they're developing to see, long term. So urine is used more for that. And again, knowing those signs of hypoglycemia and what to do. So these kids should always carry around with them some kind of simple sugar and then a starchy protein. So they will have a piece of candy or they have a juice box. Now they have those fancy paste and they'll carry it around. It's in a little thing in their backpack. Because these kids are being treated with insulin, sometimes if they have the pump on or they just gave themselves an insulin shot and they didn't count their carbs right, or they go and run and use up all their sugar, they can drop very fast, very dangerously. And then they become, they have changes in mentation, they become lethargic and kind of out of it. So it's really important that they have that simple sugar. It's typically 10 to 15 carbs, a packet of honey, like I said, a little thing of orange juice, something that will spike that sugar, and then something that will maintain it. So then a little bit of peanut butter on some crackers or peanut butter on a piece of bread. Diet, basically they have a balanced diet. There's nothing too special about their diet. Obviously, you don't want them eating bowls of ice cream and donuts, okay? But they really just need to time their carbs and insulin. So these kids get really good. They know how many carbs are in everything they eat. They know that a bread has 10 carbs and this has that. So what they will do is right before they eat a meal, and it's great because school systems put out their lunch menus prior. So even kids who buy lunches, they will put out what the lunch menu is and how many carbs are in each lunch item. So the kids will pick out what they want for lunch at school. Or if they pack a lunch, they look at the carbs. Like you guys all have seen carbs on the back of everything, right? So they count those carbs, like how much carbs do those chips have? So 18 carbs. So they'll count and they'll say, I'm going to eat 100 carbs for lunch, and they have a formula that their endocrine doctor has worked out with them that for every from 0 to 50 carbs, they're going to give them 1 insulin, and from 50 to 100, then it's 2 or whatever it is. Plus they take their sugar, and if it's normal, no extra insulin, and if it's abnormal, then they give themselves extra insulin depending on how high. So it's a lot of calculating. You can see it's very detailed. But they count all their carbs and then they give themselves their insulin and then they sit and eat their lunch. So you can see that for kids, could you be like, okay, I counted everything up, gave myself my insulin, but I was talking to my friend Susie Q the whole lunch and I forgot to eat half my carbs. Now do you see where I can get really hypoglycemic really fast? And that's why it's so important to have that snack. So it gets a little tricky for these kids and they have a lot of calculating they need to do. That's why it's got to be this collaborative management. That's why we've got to rely on so many things. Exercise is encouraged and a lot of education. We want to promote a positive self-image. We want to minimize any complications. They have a lot to learn about monitoring their glucose, a lot to learn about insulin, a lot to learn about counting carbs for diet. So it's overwhelming for the parent. It's overwhelming for the child. It takes a while for them to get used to all of this. Minimize, which one? Positive self-image, minimize complications, med interactions. And so parents need to know because who is monitoring these kids? The doctor all the time? Who's at home with the kid? Who's at school? Right? So the family really needs to understand that what happens if the kid also has asthma and they put them on a steroid. What could happen?
Sugar isn't
The sugar's going to go up, right? So the family needs to understand that. What if, they put them on an antibiotic? Could that affect it? So we need to educate the families on those type of things so that they know that, okay, my kid has an asthma attack right now. They're being put on a steroid, so their sugar might go up. They may need more insulin than normal. And that is it. I tried to go as fast as I can, y'all. I know it's a lot, but I want you to do really well on this test. All right. Any